Okay, here we have first of a couple of management lectures that I'm giving you as part of BIOL3465, Tropical Forest Ecology and Use. The first one is looking at replacement and clearing systems of timber production. This is also included in this lecture is basically non-management systems or high grading systems, or we could call it the exploitation phase of timber production in tropical forests, because unfortunately non-management or exploitation, high grading, or whatever you want to call it, is unfortunately very prevalent in tropical forests today, because it is one of the cheapest ways in which you can produce timber in the tropics. So in this lecture I want to talk about the pre-management situation, log and leave, or the exploitation phase. So basically this is non-management of tropical forests. So what would happen is woodworkers would go into the tropical forest and harvest the timber and then just leave. They wouldn't manipulate or manage the forest for a future harvest, so there is no real management. Then I'm going to take a look at replacement systems of timber production, a replacement or plantation systems of timber production, and finally I'll take a look at clearing systems of timber production. But first of all, these pre-management systems, log and leave systems, or high grading systems. So this really fits into the exploitation phase of natural resource use that I talked about in the last lecture. This is where humans will go in and exploit or mine a renewable natural resource, and basically there is no effort put into the renewable side of things. So there is no real exploration of managing the forest so that the renewability of the natural resource is not compromised. So no thought is put into the ecology of the resource, no thought is really put into any future harvesting. This obviously relies on old growth stands being continuously available, and as of today old growth stands are available for international timber companies. So these international timber companies are not going to put any money into management because it is really not worth their while. All they need to do is simply move on to the next old growth forest, which they can mine or high grade or log and leave as they have done in the past. Now this really considerably lessens their costs, because they don't have to worry about maintaining the canopy cover. They can simply go in and take out every commercially available stem that they want to, and just basically maximize their profits. As we will see in other lectures, and as we've seen in the past, this sort of management system creates a situation where the canopy is opened up, and when the canopy is opened up, that means that our selected species come in, and our selected species are no good for timber production, and so they can outcompete, or so much outcompete, but delay the growth of the K-selected timber species. So opening up the canopy too much really sets back the regeneration of the renewable timber much longer. But no thought is put into this by the timber companies, multinational timber companies, because once they go through a forest and take out all the timber, maximize their profits, they simply move on to another forest. And this has been the case since World War II. So first West Africa has been logged out, then the Philippines, then in Malaysia, Indonesia, the Amazon basin has been logged more or less continuously during that time, but more so in recent years. The Guyana Shield, and in Guyana itself has also been under pressure a lot these days, and the island of New Guinea also. So all of these areas are being logged, and they represent old growth forest. The old growth forest which is left is still large parts of the Guyana Shield, so that's Guyana, Suriname and French Guyana. Also areas like parts of the Amazon basin. The Amazon basin is so big that there are still old growth areas left in the Amazon basin, providing cheap tropical timber. The island of New Guinea is also another frontier for old growth exploitation. So these international timber companies won't worry about management, they will just basically move on to the next area. So this is basically not sustainable, and eventually those old growth forests will run out, but by then the multinational timber companies will have hoped to have maximized their profits, made a lot of money, so they don't really mind. This exploitation method is carried out extensively. There is some benefit. The benefits are entirely economic and short term. I need to talk about the experience of Malaysia, however. Malaysia is a tropical country, as you know, in Southeast Asia, that it ruthlessly exploited its tropical forests, and in so doing it managed to increase its economy to a large enough size that it raised its tax base to provide infrastructure which enabled it to make the leap out of being a third world country. So at the moment Malaysia is hovering around about the same development level as, say, Trinidad is today, and a lot of that is due to cashing in on their timber and their tropical forests, admittedly in an unsustainable way, but it enabled them to break that third world economic cycle where there isn't enough money to, the economy is too small, so there isn't enough money in the tax base to increase the infrastructure, so that means the economy cannot grow, and so the cycle continues. But for timber companies, the timber companies are the ones which make the most money. In Malaysia, they managed to direct most of their timber production to local domestic companies, so the money stayed within Malaysia and was used to grow the economy. Unfortunately, in places like Guyana, the companies which are now operating in Guyana, the large multinational companies, are from Malaysia and Indonesia, companies which grew big and capitalized on the basis of the exploitation of Malaysian forests, now have the capital resources and the infrastructure to move into other developing countries. But for Guyana, that means that most of the money will flow out of Guyana, and it's not going to have the same effect as Malaysia benefited from in the past. Timber production in Malaysia is pretty much dead, by the way. The tropical forests were mined out of their timber, so these Malaysian companies no longer can sustainably harvest in Malaysia because most of the tropical forest has been exploited to economic extinction. So, places like Guyana, Papua New Guinea, they're developing countries. It's mainly the government who owns the forest or manages the forest. So it's up to these people to make sure that they don't fall into the overexploitation or log and leave trap. So it's really up to these people, up to the governments, to make sure that the people who have the ability to exploit their tropical forests, who have the capital and have the ability to make the roads and so on, are accountable and do harvest their forest in such a way that it is able to sustain a harvest into the future. So how would they do that? Forest owners want to retain forests on their land. They want to make sure that the resource which can be harvested is renewable. So the first step they need to take is to stipulate strict conditions of harvest to make sure that it's not just a one-off. They need to make sure that harvest occurs at a low enough density that the canopy remains largely closed so that timber trees can be harvested into the future. They need to, because most of these tropical forests are uneven aged forests, in other words they have saplings and seedlings right next door to the trees which are going to be harvested, they need to make sure that when their harvestable trees are harvested, that these saplings and seedlings, which are also known as the reserve stock, I've got the term there, reserve stock, this reserve stock is preserved, that this reserve stock is protected. This will massively reduce the time that it takes for the next timber crop to come through, to grow up, to maintain those ecological processes. Enforcement of these types of management and these conditions and practices is the key to sustaining the renewability of the resource and making sure that it holds its values into the future. Unfortunately, going down to this last point, unfortunately not many tropical countries have the resources or the skilled personnel to police logging operations in what is often very remote areas. I can give you the example of Guyana, but these sorts of things happen in Trinidad as well. What happens in Guyana is in places like Barama, the Barama region, and the Barama Timber Organization, which is a subsidiary of the Malaysian logging firm Ribanan Hijau. They basically are the ones who are providing the infrastructure in these remote areas. The government doesn't have enough money to make their forest inspectors independent, so the Barama Timber Company actually provides accommodation and sustenance for these forest officers, and they offer and they provide transport for these forest officers as well. So, as you can imagine, it's quite easy for these timber companies to make sure that the inspectors from the government, who are meant to make sure that these strict silvicultural practices, management conditions are met, are not shown the areas where these rules and regulations have been flouted. So unfortunately, because these timber companies are able to control what goes on in their logging concessions, they are able to manipulate the enforcement of these management conditions such that the governments cannot be sure that their forests are being logged according to their stipulations. And quite often what happens is these companies will act to maximize their profits, and so they will harvest in an unsustainable way. So it's bad news, really. Fortunately, over the past few years, lots of organizations like the Food and Agricultural Organization, which does have a timber component, and other organizations like the ITTO, which is actually a consortium of tropical timber companies. They have, and also non-governmental organizations, environmental non-governmental organizations like field certification bodies. They have been able, I think the main NGO is called Forest Certification. They are able to monitor these logging operations and certify these logging operations as being either sustainable or unsustainable. And they are able to inform the markets in the developed countries whether or not these logging operations are being carried out correctly or not. And in this way, consumer pressure has been brought to bear on timber producers, and governments have had more ability to monitor the harvesting operations in their own country, and more ability to control it. And because of this, timber prices have been going up, and the amount of timber which is being produced using unsustainable means is slowly but surely going down. And the amount of timber which is being produced sustainably is going up. Now the amount of timber which is, the timber which is produced sustainably is going to cost more, because it is not being removed with no management under consideration. So it's being removed with more costs involved, so that the timber is more expensive. But consumers are willing to pay that, and so more and more timber companies are looking to chase that financial reward, and in so doing they are looking for certification and therefore managing their forests sustainably. So there is encouraging signs around the world. There's also signs that the amount of timber available for exploitation is running out. So there simply isn't the timber there to high grade anymore, to log and leave. There isn't the timber there anymore for timber companies just to harvest unsustainably. And this is also pushing the price of timber up and making it much more viable for timber companies and tropical country governments to maintain a good sustainable harvesting regime, and therefore value their forests much more and prevent deforestation. There's a long way to go yet, but certainly the signs are that forest management may be turning in a good direction. Alright, I'm going to go on to a couple of management systems now for timber production. There are 4 that I want to talk about, and these cover the main types of timber production systems from tropical forests. I want to talk about replacement systems or plantation systems. I want to talk about clearing systems. I want to talk about natural regeneration systems, and finally restoration systems. Now replacement systems or plantation systems are really plantation systems, and they replace a natural forest with a commercial timber plantation of a single or maybe a couple of species which are first-class timber species. These trees are planted in even-age stands. In other words, the natural forest is cleared and removed, and seedlings of the commercial species are planted and tended until they reach maturity, after which time they are harvested and the seedlings of those commercial trees are replanted once again. Now these plantations are the closest analog to an ideal forest. Now an ideal forest is also known as a normal forest. So a normal forest is a forest which conforms most closely to the ideals of maximum production of timber from a property and an even flow of that timber as one stand is harvested each year and provides an even flow of timber, which is the maximum amount of timber that you're going to get from that area. So plantations aim to maximize the amount of timber that you get from an area, both in terms of the amount of timber, but also in terms of the evenness of flow of that timber. So if timber production from a forest is the main goal of that forest, then it makes sense to create a forest that has only commercial trees and no weedy trees. And here in Trinidad, that was the philosophy, well, the main goal of the forestry division, forestry department in Trinidad was production of timber. From its formation in the early 1900s all the way through to probably the 80s, the 1980s, production of timber was the main goal of the forestry division. What that meant was that it made logical sense for the forestry division to replace natural forests with plantations. And that is why we have quite a lot of teak fields and pine fields and latterly cedar fields in Trinidad. There was a management objective to convert large areas of natural forest into teak plantations in Trinidad. And that program has only been abandoned in the 1980s. From the Second World War all the way through, natural forests were progressively cleared and planted to teak. So using this even age system, it had the advantages of providing the maximum amount of timber in a predictable time, because the growth rate of the timber would be known, and because the ecology and the growth rates and the behavior of the teak trees is well known through research, management was easiest. So the teak had already been taken into domestication, it had been researched and managed, and so much was known about it, and so it was chosen as an ideal species for replacement systems. It was also a species which performed ecologically very well in Trinidad conditions, and so it was seen as a good choice for the Trinidad system. Right, so there are problems with replacement systems, and that is why we don't have replacement systems and conversion systems going on in Trinidad forest today. First problem with replacement systems is that they are capital intensive. They require large inputs in terms of production and planting of seedling material. So you need to have nurseries with lots of staff and lots of seedling to produce the seedling material which supports these replacement systems. Sorry about that. So production and planting of seedling materials requires quite a lot of inputs. There is also maintenance required in the forest until the canopy closes. Particularly in tropical regions, when you open up the canopy, you expose the ground to the sun and the moisture, and you've just put in these seedlings. What is going to happen? Your R-selected species are just going to go nuts. They have all these resources and they are just going to grow up, and they are going to try and dominate, and they are going to choke out all of your seedlings. Particularly if it is grass which grows up, grass which is very prone to fire and will quite often burn during the dry season, and therefore kill off all the seedlings and maintain a fire climax. And that's what has happened that is what happened in Mount St. Benedict, and what is happening today up behind Tunapuna in those grass savannas up there. Replacement systems also require tending or thinning. So at some stage the teak trees, they are planted at fairly high densities to make sure that the seedlings grow up instead of spreading out and to maximize the amount of timber. But once they reach a pole size or a sapling size, or the diameter of maybe 2 or 3 centimeters dBH, they need to be thinned to reduce the competition between the individuals. And that takes time and money. Some returns can be made if the timber can be used for fence posts or broom handles or spade handles and so on, but that can be problematic. Disease, or expensive. Disease and pest control, particularly in the tropics, is also another problem with replacement systems. As we've seen before in maintenance of biodiversity, every tree will tend to have a specialist herbivore or predator associated with it. So if you try and plant high densities of a single species, what will happen in the tropics is that host-specific herbivore or predator will begin to breed up, and it will eventually wipe out or severely retard the growth of the species that you're trying to grow in your plantation or replacement system. This is a big problem with the Meliaceae, which includes the crapo tree, cedar trees, and also mahogany trees. The host-specific predator is more of a family-specific predator. It's called a Hypsipyla moth, and this moth will lay its eggs in the growing shoots of the trees. The grub will hatch out and eat and feed on the growing shoot and kill the growing shoot. This doesn't kill the tree because the tree will sprout from the sides and will continue to grow up, but what it does mean is that the shape and the form of the trunk of the tree becomes very twisted and makes it much less saleable as a timber crop. So the Hypsipyla moth is a big problem, and that's why we don't see plantations of, say, crapo, and why plantations of cedar do tend to be fairly restricted in Trinidad. And that is why we would tend to grow teak, because as I got on the next point there, generally only exotic species can be planted in commercial densities for replacement systems due to the last biotic driver, which is disease and pest control. So you can't really use native species in your replacement system because the disease and the pests, which act to keep the density of this species low, will wipe out your plantation. So what you will do is get an exotic species which leaves all its pests and diseases behind and bring it in and that can serve as your replacement system. And probably the biggest reason why replacement systems are no longer actively developed in Trinidad is that the use of the forest for anything else other than timber production is not favoured. Hunting in a plantation is not half as good as in a natural forest because there simply isn't anything in there for the game animals to eat, or there's very few resources for game animals to eat. So there is much less game animals in a plantation replacement system. Ecotourism is much less attractive in a plantation. Bird watching obviously is less attractive in a plantation forest because the diversity of birds is always going to be much lower. So in Trinidad, with the rise of the middle class, people want to use forests for all these different things, but they cannot if it has been converted into a plantation replacement system and it is simply no good for these other uses. So Trinidad governments, faced with having to pay large capital costs to maintain and establish plantation systems, have decided not to, and they've also been assisted in this decision by other parts of the society which use forests for other reasons. Okay, I'm going to move on now to our next timber production system, which is known as clearing systems. Clearing systems is where the forest tends to be extensively modified, but not completely cleared or replaced. Instead, the forest is favoured, is manipulated to favour commercial timber species. Excuse me. Non-commercial timber species are weeded out, and enrichment planting of commercial trees is often undertaken in clearing systems. The main objective of these clearing systems is to create an even-aged, normal or ideal forest to produce maximum numbers of timber, but to save money in establishing and managing those forests. Excuse me, I have to get some water. Okay, sorry about that. Clearing systems, the main objective is to create an even-aged normal forest. So, to a certain extent, the natural ecosystem and its processes are maintained to a certain extent to save a certain amount of money, particularly when it comes to regeneration costs and so on. So basically we can think of a clearing system as a forest which has had some manipulation, and that manipulation may be at different intensities. So there may be a large-scale removal of trees, or there may be only a few trees taken out every now and again. So these clearing systems aim to try and retain some sort of canopy cover and some sort of control of our selected species through the maintenance of that canopy cover, and in so doing saving on management costs. So what do clearing system requires? A good natural regeneration of commercial species. It's no good having a clearing system and you go in and you harvest the commercial species, but they don't regenerate, because then your forest is soon going to be depleted of your timber species, and it's just like running a high-grade non-management system. So what some people can do is enrich the forest with seedlings of good commercial species and plant them in the understory. Because you try and keep a more or less closed canopy of these clearing systems, it means that the trees in the understory get less light. Because they get less light, they are not going to grow as quickly as those in, say, a replacement system, which are exposed to full light and all the resources. So that means that the clearing systems require very long rotations. So it takes a long time for the next crop to grow in. Up and around 70 years has been estimated for some clearing systems. You also need to have a very good idea of the ecology and silvicultural characteristics of the target timber species. You need to know what sort of density of canopy you need in these types of forests. And you also need inputs in form of nurseries to raise seedlings and plant commercial species if the natural regeneration isn't enough, which it quite often is not. So clearing systems do require inputs, and how much those inputs are is really dependent on how much manipulation you want to undertake in that particular forest. So the benefits of a clearing system: you get a good economic return if the system works, and the resulting forest is better for other forest uses than a plantation or a replacement system, because you would usually have more than one species in the forest. You would also have a good many of the natural ecosystem processes preserved. The main problems with the clearing systems are high inputs. You still need to maintain a nursery and people to go in and weed out the non-commercial species. And you need, the main problem is that there is a lack of knowledge about the ecology of many of the timber species. But probably the biggest problem is the long rotation times that you have with clearing forests. Now, if you have a large enough forest, that may not be a problem. If you have 70 blocks, which you can harvest once a year, then you will have a continuous flow of timber. But you're going to have a large part of your forest at any one time under regeneration and therefore unavailable. A type of clearing system was started up in Trinidad but has since been abandoned, and that's in arena forest. And we will be going to the arena forest to compare a replacement system with a clearing system for the lab later on in the course. So the shelterwood system in the arena forest in Trinidad evolved from what was originally planned to be a replacement system, but the costs of maintaining a replacement system were found to be too high for the arena forest, and so a clearing system was developed where large numbers of the native species were left behind to maintain a closed canopy after the first harvest, and then regeneration, natural regeneration, was monitored and if necessary supplemented with commercial timber species, seedlings of commercial timber species. And once they had established and grown tall enough, the cover of the native species was removed and allowed these native timber species, these seedlings, to grow up. Because this requires repeated going into the forest and repeated harvesting, it was found to be quite an expensive operation. And the reason why it closed down in the arena forest in the end was had its roots in a completely separate economic phenomenon in Trinidad, and that was the rise of the oil and gas industry. Large amounts of the labor for this clearing system in arena forest used to be carried out by charcoal burners. Charcoal burners would go in and harvest the native tree species which were no good for timber, most notably the fine leaf or Pentaclethra macroloba, and they would convert these trees into charcoal and sell that charcoal in markets where charcoal was the main form of fuel for household cooking and so on. Once kerosene captured the household cooking market, and after that natural gas, coal was no longer required. So all the charcoal businesses went out of business, and so there were no charcoal burners left to provide that labor in the arena forest for the clearing system. They experimented a while with poisoning the trees, but that created a situation where the forest became a death trap, with dead standing up trees all over the place, shedding limbs on people left, right and center, so that had to be abandoned. So the clearing system was basically abandoned through lack of money. Okay, I'm going to leave it there while I have another coughing attack. I hope you've learned something there, and I'll see you in the lectures. Bye bye now.